He was a poor single father who only dreamed of giving his little daughter a home. When he bought an abandoned piece of land for almost nothing, everyone laughed at him. But the moment he opened the old wooden shed, what he found inside changed their lives forever. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you're watching this video from. The morning they left, the city was gray and hollow, as though even the sky had forgotten what warmth felt like. Smoke hung over the rooftops, soft and heavy, blurring the edges of the skyline into a haze of soot and memory. Ethan Marsh sat behind the wheel of his dented truck, his fingers tight around the steering wheel. Beside him, his daughter Ellie watched the world roll past her window, her chin resting in her small hand. She was 8, all bones and bright eyes. Too quiet for a child her age. The factory district was empty at that hour, and the echo of their tires on the cracked pavement seemed louder than it should have been, like the sound of leaving something that didn't want to be left behind. For years, Ethan had lived the same gray routine: shift work at the metal plant, nights spent half asleep at the kitchen table over bills he couldn't pay, and mornings when the sound of the alarm felt heavier than his body could bear. After his wife Claire had died, something in him had gone quiet. He had learned to speak softly around Ellie, to smile when she looked at him. But inside, there was a hollowness that nothing could fill. He had promised Claire once that their daughter would grow up somewhere open, somewhere with grass and wind instead of iron and smoke. For a long time, he had believed that promise had died with her. Then came the night he couldn't sleep. He had sat in the dim light of their small apartment, the air thick with the smell of metal and damp, and opened his old laptop just to escape the silence. The advertisement had looked like a mistake, an abandoned plot of land for sale on an auction site, starting bid lower than a week's wages. The photos were blurry, showing only tangles of weeds and the shadow of some crooked structure that might once have been a shed. The description was short and almost mocking. Unattended rural land, no guarantees, sold as is. He had stared at the listing for a long time. The land lay just outside a forgotten place called Haven Creek, a town barely mentioned on modern maps. A few anonymous users had left comments under the post, most joking that the soil was cursed, that nothing would grow there, that even the birds avoided the trees. But something about the image, about the way the sunlight fell across the neglected clearing, had tugged at him. Maybe it was foolishness, or maybe it was the kind of hope that comes only when a man has nothing left to lose. Ellie had wandered into the room that night, sleepy-eyed, wearing one of her mother's old sweaters. She had leaned over his shoulder and squinted at the screen. "Is that our new house?" she'd asked. And though the words had been half a joke, something inside Ethan had tightened. "Maybe," he'd said quietly. And even as he spoke, he knew he was already deciding. In the days that followed, everyone he spoke to told him he was out of his mind. His former co-workers at the plant laughed outright when they heard. "A farmer now, are you?" One of them had said. "You'll find more rust than roots out there." The landlord warned him not to expect a refund on the deposit. Even the man at the auction house seemed confused when Ethan transferred the money, as though he couldn't believe anyone would pay real cash for that patch of forgotten soil. But when the papers arrived by mail, stamped and sealed, the weight of them felt like something sacred in his hands. For the first time in years, he owned something that was truly his, and, by extension, something that was Ellie's. They left the city before dawn, their few belongings packed into the bed of the truck. The air grew cleaner with every mile. The concrete gave way to gravel. The horizon opened wider, and even Ellie seemed to breathe differently. She hummed softly, a tune he didn't recognize, as the truck bounced along narrow country roads lined with fences that had long since given up. Holding anything in the old GPS failed a few miles out of Haven Creek, and they navigated by a printed map creases worn deep from the fold, lines, the paper soft like cloth. When they finally reached the turnoff, it was little more than 2 parallel ruts cutting through tall grass. The wheels hissed as they rolled over weeds and stones. At the end of the path, the land opened before them in a broad, uneven clearing. The fields were overgrown, the soil pale and cracked, the fences half swallowed by vines. And there, standing crooked at the center, like a sentinel from another time, was the shed. It wasn't much to look at, just a small wooden structure, sagging on one side, its roof patched with rusted sheets of tin. The wood had turned nearly black with age. A few boards had fallen away, leaving gaps that looked like missing teeth. But despite its ruin, the building had an odd kind of presence, as if it were still clinging to its purpose long after everything around it had forgotten. Ellie climbed out of the truck first, her shoes sinking slightly into the damp earth. The air smelled of moss and rain. Ethan followed, his boots crunching on gravel. For a long moment, he simply stood there, letting the wind press against his face. The silence was unlike anything he'd ever known. Not empty, but full, thick with unseen life. The faint hum of insects, the whisper of the grass, the soft creak of the shed's warped boards. It all came together into something that felt almost alive. He walked the perimeter slowly, taking it all in. The property stretched farther than he had expected, the field sloping gently toward a line of trees. Beneath the weeds, he found the remains of what might once have been a garden. Old broken rows of wooden stakes jutted from the soil like ribs. Near the edge of the clearing, a low stone wall stood half-collapsed, covered in moss. The more he looked, the more he saw hints of a life that had once thrived here. A well gone dry, a patch of wild flowers stubbornly blooming where a house might have stood. Ellie wandered ahead, her small boots leaving prints in the mud. "Daddy," she called softly. "There's something on the door." He turned and saw her pointing toward the shed. On the weathered wood of the door, half hidden by grime, was a carved mark, a circle enclosing a single letter. G. The carving was old, the edges smoothed by years of rain, but still clear. Ethan ran his fingers over it. The groove was deep, deliberate. Maybe it was the name of whoever lived here, he murmured to himself. Though he couldn't shake the strange feeling that it wasn't just an initial. It was a symbol. Something meant to endure. The thought unsettled him, though he couldn't explain why. Inside the truck, he found a crowbar among his tools. The door handle of the shed was stiff with rust. He jiggled it once, twice, and the hinges groaned in protest. "Guess we'll have to fix that," he muttered, half to Ellie, half to himself. But before he could pry it open, the wind shifted and the air changed. It was subtle at first, a low vibration underfoot, like the distant rumble of machinery, though there was nothing for miles. Then, from somewhere within the shed, came a single metallic clatter. The sound was hollow, sharp, unmistakably real. Ellie jumped and clutched his arm. What was that? Ethan froze, the crowbar halfway to the latch. He listened. Silence, only the rustle of weeds and the far-off cry of a crow. The rational part of his mind told him it was nothing. A loose chain, a falling tool, the wind moving something old. But another part, the part that remembered the hollow echo of empty rooms and the way grief can turn shadows into voices, couldn't let it go so easily. He lowered the crowbar and stepped back, his eyes fixed on the dark seam between the planks. There was no movement inside, no sign of life. The stillness pressed against his skin, heavier than before. Ellie whispered, "Maybe someone left something in there." He wanted to answer her, to reassure her, but the words wouldn't come. The air around them felt charged, like the moment before a storm. Finally, he forced a smile and tousled her hair. "We'll check it tomorrow," he said. "Daylight will make it easier." But even as he spoke, he kept glancing back at the shed, unable to shake the feeling that it was watching them. Waiting. They set up a small tent near the truck that night. The sky cleared as darkness fell, revealing a river of stars he hadn't seen since childhood. Ellie fell asleep quickly, wrapped in her mother's old quilt, her face peaceful. Ethan sat by the dying embers of a small fire, the shed a dark outline in the distance. The moonlight touched its roof, silvering the edges, and for an instant he could have sworn he saw movement, a faint glint behind the cracks of the wooden wall, like metal catching the light. He blinked, and it was gone. He told himself it was imagination, the play of shadows, nothing more. But as the wind moved through the tall grass, he heard it again, the faint, unmistakable clink of metal from within the shed. This time it was slower, deliberate, as though something or someone was stirring inside. Ethan sat motionless, staring at the dark shape across the clearing, until the fire burned down to coals. Only when the last ember went out did the sound finally stop. He lay beside his daughter, eyes open to the dark, the weight of the silence pressing against his chest. He had thought he'd bought a forgotten piece of land, something empty and still. But as he drifted toward uneasy sleep, one thought settled deep in his mind and refused to leave. Maybe the land had been waiting for him. And maybe, just maybe, it wasn't empty at all. The morning came soft and pale, the kind of light that makes the world look hesitant to wake. Mist hung low over the grass, curling around the wheels of the truck like smoke. And the shed stood motionless in the center of it all, black and wet with dew. Ethan rose stiffly from the ground beside the fire pit, every muscle aching from a night of uneasy sleep. He glanced toward the tent, where Ellie still slept, her hair spilling across the blanket in golden tangles. For a moment, he simply watched her, grateful she hadn't heard the sounds that had kept him awake for most of the night. The faint metallic clicks that came and went like shallow breaths. When he finally turned his eyes back to the shed, the unease returned. In the daylight, it seemed less sinister, but somehow more real. He could see every crooked plank, every nail half sunk into rotting wood, every scar of time along the walls. It wasn't a ghost story anymore. It was something solid, something waiting. He poured himself a cup of coffee from the tin kettle, the liquid lukewarm and bitter, and stood facing the structure, trying to decide whether his fear had been born of imagination or warning. By the time Ellie stirred and crawled out of the tent, the mist was thinning. She blinked up at him sleepily. "Are we going home today?" she asked, rubbing her eyes. He smiled faintly. "No, honey. We just got here." She looked around at the overgrown field and the leaning fences. "It's quiet here," she said. "Too quiet." He tried to make light of it, but her words sank into him like a seed. Quiet had always been what he thought he wanted, but this silence felt alive. Watchful, he forced himself into motion, grabbing his tools from the truck. "Come on," he said. "Let's see what's inside that shed. Maybe there's something useful." The door resisted him again, the rusted hinges groaning like something in pain, the wood swollen from years of rain. Ethan wedged the crowbar into the gap between the boards, braced himself, and pulled. The nails squealed as they tore loose, and a sudden gust of musty air rushed out from within, thick with the scent of rot and something older. Dust, oil, and faintly the metallic tang of iron. When the last board fell away, the interior revealed itself in strips of light, filtered through holes in the roof. Dust swirled in the beams like fog. The place was cluttered, but not chaotic. Objects had been arranged with a sense of order that time had merely softened. Against one wall stood a workbench, littered with tools, chisels, hammers, and an iron vise, their handles gray with age. A kerosene lamp sat at the corner of the bench, its glass blackened with soot, as though someone had once set it down mid-task and never returned. Ellie crept up behind him, her small hand gripping his sleeve. "It smells funny," she whispered. "It's just old," he said, though the words didn't comfort even himself. The air in the shed carried a weight that pressed on his chest. It wasn't decay, it was memory. He stepped inside, the floorboards creaking beneath his boots. There was a chair near the center of the room, its legs uneven but sturdy, and beside it, a table covered in papers. He brushed away a thick layer of dust. Beneath it lay a series of sketches, blueprints, or perhaps plans of some kind, drawn in steady, confident lines. The paper was yellowed and brittle, the ink faded to brown, but he could still make out measurements and symbols. In the corner of one, a familiar mark had been stamped in ink, the same circle with the letter G enclosed within it. Ellie tugged at his sleeve again. "Daddy, look." She was pointing toward the far corner of the shed, where something large and square loomed half-hidden beneath a rotting tarp. He approached it carefully, the boards moaning under his steps. With one firm pull, he dragged the tarp aside. It was a chest, wooden, reinforced with iron bands, the metal eaten through by rust. On the lid, carved deep into the grain, was that same circle and the letter G, more precise this time, as though whoever had made it had done so with purpose, not ornament. He crouched, running his fingers across the design. The groove was deep enough to catch his skin. "Maybe there's treasure," Ellie said with a hopeful grin. "Maybe," he replied. Though what he felt wasn't excitement, but something colder. A sense that whatever lay inside was meant to stay hidden. He tried the latch. The padlock was thick and crusted, fused shut by years of neglect. He searched the workbench, found a rusted hammer, and struck the lock once, twice. On the third blow, it snapped open, the sound echoing through the small room like a gunshot. The hinges resisted at first, then gave way with a sigh. Inside, wrapped in layers of faded cloth, were a few objects. A small metal plate, etched with lines that resembled a map. A round pendant, made of bronze, with a jagged symbol that looked like a lightning bolt, and a thick leather-bound book. Its cover darkened almost to black. He lifted the book gently. The leather was dry and cracked, flaking beneath his touch. When he opened it, the scent of dust and ink rose like breath. The handwriting inside was neat, deliberate. The ink slightly smeared in places. On the first page was written a name, Gideon Rawls. He read aloud, his voice barely more than a whisper. "The fire took the village and left me with ash, but even ash can feed new flame, if the right hands tend it." Ellie leaned closer, her eyes wide. "Who's Gideon?" "I don't know," he said softly. He turned the page. The entries were dated from over a century ago. Gideon wrote of the land, of the storms that came in spring and the droughts that followed. He wrote of working the forge, of shaping metal and stone, and of watching everything he loved burn to the ground one summer night when a fire swept through Haven Creek. The last lines of that entry trembled across the page. "I will build something that cannot burn. I will give the fire a place to live, not destroy." As Ethan read, the story of Gideon began to form in his mind. A man alone after tragedy, driven to create something eternal. The later pages spoke of plans, of measurements, of the building of an underground forge, a chamber beneath the ground where the flames of his craft could survive whatever came above. A sanctuary of work and will, Gideon called it, where the fire never dies, and the hands that come after me may find what I could not finish. Ellie wandered toward the window, peering out through a crack in the wall. "He sounds sad," she said. Ethan closed the book carefully, the weight of it heavy in his palms. "Maybe he was," he said. But maybe he was hopeful too. He placed the journal back inside the chest. But his eyes lingered on the metal plate that lay beside it. The etchings were faint, but clear enough to recognize as lines and coordinates, some kind of map of the property. Near the center was a small mark in the shape of a triangle, beneath which were the faint words, "The hearth below." That phrase pulled at him, beneath the shed. Was that where Gideon's sanctuary had been built? He studied the floor again, the uneven planks, the places where the wood seemed to sink. Ellie's voice cut through his thoughts. "Daddy, look at the door." He turned. The wind had picked up outside, moaning through the cracks. The shed door, which he was sure he'd left wedged open, was now swinging slowly inward, the hinges screeching with each movement. It closed with a deep thud that made the walls tremble. Ellie ran to him, clutching his hand. "Stay here," he said, his voice steady, though his pulse was not. He moved toward the door and pushed it open again, stepping into the gray light. The air outside was still, no wind, no movement. He could see the grass bending gently, but nothing that could have caused the door to move so violently. When he turned back, the sound reached him again, not from outside, but from beneath his feet. It was faint, but unmistakable, a slow, hollow thump, as though something deep underground had shifted or struck the underside of the floor. Once, then again, then silence. Ellie's face had gone pale. "Daddy." He knelt and placed his hand on the floorboards. The wood was cool, but he could feel the faintest vibration lingering there. He forced a smile he didn't feel. "It's just settling," he said. "Old wood does that sometimes." But even as he said it, he knew he was lying to her and to himself. When they stepped outside again, the mist had fully lifted. The field looked almost serene beneath the morning sun, the shed casting its long, uneven shadow across the grass. But as Ethan glanced back at it one last time, something caught his eye through one of the gaps in the boards. Just above where the floor met the wall, a thin wisp of dust rose slowly upward, as if disturbed from below. He stared for a long moment, the air heavy around him. Whatever secrets Gideon Rawls had buried here, they weren't gone. The shed hadn't just been waiting for him to find it. It had been guarding something. As the sun climbed higher and the light sharpened, Ethan felt the truth settle cold in his bones. He hadn't bought an empty piece of land. He'd bought a story that wasn't finished, and somewhere beneath his feet, it was still being written. That night, the wind carried no sound. Even the insects had gone silent, as if the land itself were holding its breath. Ethan sat awake long after Ellie had fallen asleep, his flashlight balanced on his knee, the open pages of Gideon Rawls's journal trembling faintly in his hands. He had read the same paragraph half a dozen times, the words etching themselves into his thoughts until they felt almost spoken aloud. The forge beneath will live when the world above forgets. There the flame will wait for the hands that understand its purpose. He couldn't ignore what he had felt beneath the shed that morning. That hollow thump echoing through the boards. It wasn't just a creak of old timber. It had been deliberate, rhythmic, almost human. And the more he read Gideon's words, the more that sound returned to him, like a pulse under the ground. By dawn, the decision had formed itself. He couldn't rest until he knew what was beneath that floor. When Ellie woke, he tried to make the morning seem ordinary. He cooked oatmeal on the small camping stove, forced a smile, and told her they'd be working on clearing the weeds around the shed. She didn't argue, but her eyes lingered on him longer than usual, as if she sensed the weight behind his words. The air was crisp when they stepped outside. Dew glistened on the grass, and a faint fog curled around the edges of the field. Ethan gathered his tools, a shovel, a small spade, a crowbar, and set them against the wall of the shed. The structure loomed above them, its boards darkened with moisture. The faint carved G on the door glinting where the morning light struck it. He pressed his palm to the wood, once almost reverently, then began to work. The first step was to clear the ground around the shed. The weeds grew thick and stubborn, their roots tangled in the soil. Each stroke of the spade revealed fragments of the past. A broken horseshoe, a rusted nail, the remains of a glass bottle, clouded by dirt. Ellie gathered the smaller bits in a bucket, her curiosity outweighing her unease. Every so often she asked questions about who Gideon might have been, why he'd built his forge here. But Ethan had no answers. The journal had hinted at solitude and loss, not clarity. It spoke of building, of hiding, of a man trying to make his mark against oblivion. By midday, they had uncovered nearly the entire base of the shed. Ethan studied the foundation carefully. The ground sloped slightly downward behind it, the soil softer, darker there, as if it had been disturbed long ago. He knelt and pressed his ear to the earth. There was no sound now, no vibration. But something about that patch of ground felt different. He remembered the map etched on the metal plate from the chest, the small triangle marked with the words, "The hearth below." The location matched almost perfectly. He turned to Ellie, who was resting in the shade of the truck. "I think we're close," he said quietly. The next hours were a blur of digging. The soil here was looser, crumbling easily under the shovel, rich with the scent of decay and age. Each shovelful released a faint, damp chill that rose like breath from the ground. Sweat ran down Ethan's neck, soaking the collar of his shirt. His hands blistered, his back burned. But he didn't stop. Ellie watched silently, sometimes bringing him water, sometimes just sitting nearby with the journal open on her knees, tracing the lines of Gideon's handwriting with her finger. It was near dusk when the shovel struck something hard. The sound was dull but unmistakable. He froze, his heartbeat quickening. Carefully, he scraped away the surrounding soil until the outline of a flat wooden surface appeared. It wasn't a rock, it was a hatch. The wood was dark and damp, its grain swollen with time, but the iron hinges at its edge were still visible. Moss clung thick around the edges, and when he brushed it away, his fingers came away slick and green. A circular iron ring was set into the center, a handle heavy and worn smooth. Ellie came to his side, her breath quick. "What is it?" He looked up at her, his voice barely a whisper. "It's what he built." They worked together to clear the rest of the soil, until the hatch was fully exposed. It was larger than he'd expected, nearly the size of a doorway laid flat against the ground. He grasped the ring and pulled, but the hatch barely moved. It was sealed tight, perhaps swollen from decades of rain. He fetched the crowbar and wedged it beneath the edge. The wood groaned in protest, the iron hinge shrieking as he forced it upward. With one final heave, the hatch gave way, opening with a sudden rush of air that smelled of rust and stone and something ancient. A dark shaft yawned beneath them, descending into shadow. A wooden ladder clung to one wall, its rungs slick with grime, but intact. When Ethan leaned forward with his flashlight, the beam cut through the gloom, revealing rough stone walls descending farther than he could see. The light caught on something below, metal perhaps, or water. Ellie clutched his sleeve. "You're not going down there, are you?" He looked at her and saw his own fear mirrored in her eyes. But beneath the fear was something else. Trust. She believed that if he went down, he would come back. "I have to see," he said softly. "It's part of the land now. Maybe it's part of us." He tested the first rung. It creaked but held, then another. The air grew cooler as he descended, damp and heavy, tasting of earth and metal. The light from above faded, until only his flashlight pierced the dark. The walls glistened faintly with moisture, and the sound of his own breathing filled the narrow space. Step by step, he climbed downward, each creak of the ladder echoing like a question. At last, his boots met solid ground. He swung the flashlight around, and the beam revealed a chamber carved directly into the stone. The ceiling arched low, supported by thick wooden beams blackened by age. The floor was layered with dust, so deep it softened his steps. He moved slowly, turning in place. The chamber was larger than he had imagined, nearly the size of a small house. Against one wall stood shelves filled with glass jars, most clouded and opaque, some containing what looked like dried herbs or powders turned to dust. Along another wall, a massive iron structure dominated the space. A forge, its mouth dark and cold, the chimney stretching up toward unseen vents. Beside it sat an anvil, its surface scarred and pitted, but solid. He moved closer, his flashlight trembling slightly in his hand. The air was thick here, untouched for a century, yet it carried a strange stillness, not deathly, but preserved, like a room sealed away from time. On the wall above the forge, carved into the stone, were words in deep, precise letters: "Fire is memory, labor is life." He whispered the words aloud, and they echoed faintly back to him. A sense of awe replaced his fear. This was Gideon's sanctuary of work and will. It had survived everything: the fire, the years, the silence. Behind him, a small sound broke the stillness. A soft creak. Wood shifting against stone. He turned sharply, his light swinging across the room. Ellie was peering down from the mouth of the hatch above, her small face pale in the glow. "Are you okay?" she called. "I'm fine," he said. "It's safe. You can come down if you want." She hesitated only a moment before descending, careful and slow, until her boots touched the ground beside him. Her eyes widened as she took in the chamber. "The forge, the tools. It's like a secret house," she said. Her voice hushed. He nodded. A house built for fire. They explored together, their footsteps raising faint clouds of dust that glimmered in the flashlight beam. In the far corner of the room, behind a stack of decayed wooden crates, something metallic caught the light. He brushed away the debris, revealing a square panel set into the stone. It was a door, a safe, heavy and rusted, with a keyhole at its center. The letter G was engraved above it, small but unmistakable. He reached instinctively for his pocket and pulled out the old key they had found inside the chest. It was iron, ornate, its teeth sharp and precise despite the years. His heart pounded as he fitted it into the lock. It turned smoothly, almost eagerly, and the mechanism released with a low, resonant click that echoed through the chamber. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. Then he reached for the handle and pulled. The door swung open with a deep groan, releasing a gust of stale air and the faint scent of oil. The beam of the flashlight spilled over the contents within a collection of objects, gleaming faintly in the dust. Gold, perhaps, or brass, stacks of parchment, and the edges of something wrapped in cloth. Ellie exhaled sharply. "Is it treasure?" Ethan didn't answer. His gaze lingered on the wrapped bundle in the center, bound with a strip of leather. It was too deliberate, too carefully placed to be mere valuables. He reached out and lifted it into the light. The cloth fell away to reveal a book bound in dark leather. Its cover embossed with the same symbol, a circle around the letter G. As he held it, a faint tremor passed through the floor. It was so slight he might have imagined it. Yet the dust along the wall drifted down like breath. Somewhere in the distance, deep in the stone, came a hollow metallic ring, as if a hammer had struck an anvil just once, and then gone silent. Ellie pressed close to him, her voice small. "Daddy, did you hear that?" He swallowed hard, the taste of iron in the air. The forge loomed before them, silent and black, but for a moment he thought he saw something deep within its dark mouth, a faint ember of red, glowing and then fading, like the last heartbeat of a long-dead flame. He placed the book gently on the anvil, his hand trembling. Whatever Gideon Rawls had left buried here had not been meant for the eyes of strangers. It had been waiting patiently beneath the earth, waiting for someone to listen. Above them, the world was silent. The setting sun casting its last light through the cracks in the old shed. Down here, the darkness felt alive. Ethan stood frozen, listening to the fading echo of that single metallic sound. And in it, he felt the weight of a century pressing upon him, the pulse of the forge that had never truly gone cold. The air inside the underground chamber seemed heavier now that Ethan had opened the safe. For a long moment, he and Ellie stood motionless, the beam of the flashlight trembling slightly in his hand as it danced across the contents of the vault. Time itself felt as if it had slowed, folding in around them. The silence wasn't dead. It was waiting, filled with the kind of stillness that only follows discovery. Ethan reached into the safe and lifted a handful of coins. They were tarnished, but unmistakably gold. Beneath them lay a collection of tools, small hammers, chisels, measuring instruments crafted with care and precision. Their surfaces dulled but intact, and resting among them was an envelope thick and sealed with brittle wax. The seal bore the same emblem, the circle enclosing the letter G that had haunted them since they first stepped foot on this land. He broke the seal gently. The paper inside crackled like dry leaves as he unfolded it. The handwriting was neat but rushed. The ink faded to brown, the strokes uneven, as though written by a tired or aging hand. He read aloud softly, his voice echoing faintly off the stone walls. "To the one who finds this place, you hold not only what I earned, but what I built. These coins, this metal, these tools, they are not riches, they are seeds. Use them not to escape the world, but to repair it." The fire of creation should never serve greed. Let the work of your hands feed others, not your vanity. If you understand this, then the forge is yours. The note was signed, Gideon Rawls. The words sank into him slowly, deeper than he expected. He looked around the chamber. The forge, the books, the anvil, all of it made sense now. This wasn't a hoard of wealth. It was a message, an inheritance, not of money, but of purpose. Gideon had left behind a test. Ellie stood close beside him, her face faintly illuminated by the glow of the flashlight. "Does this mean we're rich?" she asked in a whisper, her eyes bright. Ethan hesitated. The word felt wrong in this place. "No," he said finally. "I don't think that's what he meant. I think he wanted us to finish what he started." She frowned. "But what did he start?" He didn't answer. Instead, he placed the letter carefully back into the safe and turned toward the forge. The cold iron mouth seemed to stare back at him. He imagined Gideon here a century earlier, working alone through nights lit only by flame, shaping tools and thoughts, pouring his grief and his hope into the metal. The image struck something deep in him, a familiar ache. He understood what it was to build out of pain, to take loss, and hammer it into something that could last. When they climbed the ladder back to the surface, the evening light was already dimming. The hatch fell closed with a heavy thud behind them, sealing the cool air below. Ethan sat in the grass beside the shed for a long while, the letter still echoing in his mind. Let the work of your hands feed others. He had come here chasing a dream of escape, a refuge from the exhaustion and humiliation of poverty. But now, for the first time, he saw that the land didn't offer escape. It demanded something more. That night, he couldn't sleep. The moonlight spilled pale across the clearing, and the outline of the shed was a jagged silhouette against the horizon. He kept thinking about the forge below, the sleeping fire that had once filled the chamber with light and heat. He imagined striking a spark, bringing the old tools to life again, and felt a strange certainty that Gideon would have wanted that. Around midnight, he rose quietly, pulled on his boots, and went outside. The night air was cold, the grass slick with dew. He carried with him a small lantern and one of the tools he'd brought from the truck, a piece of flint he'd used for camping fires. The hatch opened with a low groan. He climbed down the ladder, lantern in hand, the flames shivering in the darkness. When he reached the bottom, the air felt different than before. Not oppressive, but alive, like the breath of something stirring after a long sleep. He approached the forge and set the lantern beside it. The iron surface gleamed faintly. He could almost feel the memory of heat radiating from it, though it had been cold for a century. Slowly, almost reverently, he gathered bits of wood and paper from the corners of the room and placed them inside the hearth. The sound of his movements echoed softly against the stone. He struck the flint once, twice, and a spark leapt into the darkness. It landed among the paper, glowing, fading, then flaring again. The flame caught. It grew quickly, licking at the old dry wood until a soft, steady fire filled the forge. The light spilled across the walls, and for the first time the underground chamber was alive again. The jars gleamed on their shelves, the metal tools shone dully, and the carved words above the forge fire's memory, "Labor is life," seemed to glow from within the stone. Ethan stepped back, his heart hammering. He had expected warmth, light, maybe even comfort. What he felt instead was presence. The air seemed to hum faintly. In the wavering glow, a shadow moved across the wall. Not his, not Ellie's, but the shape of a man standing beside the forge. His outline, indistinct but unmistakable. Ethan froze. The shadow lingered for a breath, then faded as the fire steadied. He let out a shuddering exhale. "Thank you," he whispered into the air, unsure whether he was speaking to Gideon or to the land itself. When he climbed back up to the surface, dawn was breaking. The first light touched the roof of the shed, and the mist burned away in soft ribbons. He felt different, lighter. The fear that had shadowed him since they arrived was gone. The land no longer felt abandoned. It felt awake. Over the next few days, Ethan worked without pause. He tore down the rotting boards of the shed and replaced them with fresh lumber he salvaged from nearby ruins. He cleaned the soil, burned weeds, and cleared a path between the field and the road. With every nail driven and plank set, he felt as though he were rebuilding not just a structure, but a promise. Ellie helped where she could, carrying small tools, sweeping sawdust from the floor. The days passed in a rhythm that felt strangely right, as if the land itself had been waiting to hear the sound of work again. One afternoon, while sanding a new door frame, Ethan noticed something unusual. From the forge below, now reopened, and active thin curls of smoke rose through the gaps in the ground. Even though he hadn't lit a fire that morning, he climbed down uneasy and found the forge cold to the touch. Yet, faint traces of warmth glowed in the ashes, pulsing like embers beneath the surface. The light flickered softly, forming the faint suggestion of words that shimmered and vanished almost too quickly to read. But he caught a fragment before it disappeared. "You continue my labor." He stood motionless for a long while, the message burning in his mind. It didn't frighten him. If anything, it filled him with peace. That night, as he and Ellie sat by the fire outside, she leaned against him and looked up at the stars. "Mom would have liked it here," she said quietly. He nodded. "She would have. Do you think Mr. Gideon is happy we found his place?" Ethan gazed at the horizon where the rebuilt shed stood, its windows glowing softly with lamplight. "I think he's more than happy," he said. "I think he's here." The next morning, when the sun rose, the light caught the roof of the shed and spilled over the field like a blessing. Ethan walked to the doorway and stood for a long time, watching the golden haze settle across the grass. The world around him no longer felt like ruin. It felt like beginning. But even as he turned away, one thought stayed with him. He knew now that what lay beneath the earth was more than stone and steel. It was a legacy, and with it came responsibility. Gideon's letter had not given him a treasure to spend. It had given him a choice. What he built from here, and how he used the gift, would decide what kind of man he truly was. That night, long after Ellie had gone to sleep, Ethan returned once more to the forge. The fire still glowed faintly, though he had left it untended. In the dim light, he placed his hands on the anvil and felt its cool strength beneath his palms. "I'll build it right," he whispered. "I promise." Outside, a wind rose through the clearing, carrying with it the faint scent of smoke and iron, and as it passed, the flame within the forge brightened for just a moment, as though an answer. Then it settled again, steady and calm, waiting for morning. Spring arrived quietly, with mornings wrapped in mist, and evenings that smelled of rain and soil. The land that had once been gray and empty now breathed with color. Grass pushed through the dark earth in soft green blades, and birds nested in the branches of trees that had seemed lifeless only months before. Ethan's hands were calloused from work, his back aching each night. But every ache felt earned. The shed that had once leaned like an old memory now stood straight, its boards strong, its roof new. Sunlight caught the fresh wood and made it glow like amber. From a distance, the place looked alive again, as if the land itself had decided to forgive the years of neglect. The forge below was no longer a secret, but a heartbeat that pulsed beneath the earth. Ethan had cleaned the chamber, restored the tools, and built a new hatch and ladder. He had even repaired the vent that led to the surface, so the smoke could curl upward into the sky again, carrying the scent of iron and oak into the open air. At first, it was only he who worked there, but as weeks passed, word spread to the nearby towns that a man had reopened the old forge at Haven Creek, and soon people began to come. They were farmers with broken plows, blacksmiths with dull tools, young men with rough hands who wanted to learn. Ethan never turned anyone away. He taught them what he remembered from his years at the metal plant, and what he learned and knew from Gideon's notes. They worked together through long days, their hammers ringing against the anvils like music. The sound traveled through the valley, carrying far into the hills. Those who had once laughed at Ethan's purchase now came to watch, to ask questions, to trade. Slowly, almost without notice, a community began to grow around the place. Ellie became the heart of it all. She ran between the workers, carrying water, sorting tools, and helping Ethan organize materials. Her laughter filled the clearing in the evenings when the men rested and shared food. She had grown taller, her hair longer, and there was something in her face that reminded Ethan of her mother, steady, bright, unafraid. Sometimes he would catch her standing near the shed at twilight, looking toward the fields, and he knew she was dreaming of what more the land could become. He began to dream, too, not of money or escape, but of creation. With every beam he raised and every field they cleared, the vision grew clearer, a place where people could work, live, and learn, where hands, once idle, could find purpose again. The forge became more than a workshop. It became a gathering place. Evenings filled with the sound of voices with laughter and stories. Someone started calling it the Haven, and the name stayed. On a quiet night after everyone had gone home, Ethan sat alone beside the forge. The fire glowed softly, reflecting off the curved walls, its heat steady, but not consuming. He thought of Gideon often, of the man who had built all this with his bare hands and a broken heart. It was strange how two lives could connect across a century, how one man's grief could become another man's hope. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small bronze pendant they had found in the chest. Its lightning-marked surface gleamed faintly in the firelight. He set it on the anvil and whispered, "You built something that lasted, old man. You just needed someone to find it." In the days that followed, the forge's rhythm became the rhythm of the land itself. The clang of metal marked the hours, and the rising smoke was a sign of life, not ruin. People came to trade their labor for food, their skill for shelter. The earth around the shed, once barren, now held gardens and fences, barns and tool sheds. Children played where weeds had once grown taller than a man's head. And through it all, Ethan worked without rest, his hands rough, but his heart at peace. One evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the horizon in shades of orange and gold, he stood with Ellie outside the forge. She had finished planting a small tree near the entrance, its leaves trembling in the wind. "It'll be big one day," she said proudly. "Bigger than the shed." He smiled, resting a hand on her shoulder. "That's the point," he said. "Everything we build should outgrow us." That night, he sat by the window of the rebuilt shed, watching the glow of the forge flicker beneath the floor. The warmth spread upward through the boards, comforting and constant. He thought of the path that had brought him here, the city's cold nights, the endless gray days, the hopelessness that had once sat in his chest like stone. All of it felt distant now, like a story that had happened to someone else. What remained was purpose, the kind of quiet fulfillment that comes not from finding something new, but from repairing what was broken. When he finally went to bed, he dreamed of the fire below, of its steady glow, its breath-like pulse. In the dream, he wasn't alone. A man stood beside him at the forge, tall and broad-shouldered, his hands marked with soot. He didn't speak, but he smiled. And Ethan knew it was Gideon. Together, they worked the metal until it shone, until sparks filled the air like falling stars. When he awoke, the smell of smoke lingered faintly in the air, and for a moment, he wondered if it had truly been a dream at all. Years passed, as years always do, quietly and without announcement. The haven grew. The forge became a school of craft, where young men and women learned to shape iron and wood, to build tools and mend engines. Ellie, no longer a child, took over much of the teaching. Her steady hands and calm patience, reminding everyone of her father. The people who came here brought with them stories and hope, and the land responded in kind, offering abundance, where once there had been only weeds. On a warm summer evening many years later, Ethan sat outside the forge, now gray-haired but strong, watching the younger workers finish their day. The sound of hammers rose and fell like a familiar song. He could see Ellie standing by the doorway, her face lit by the glow of the forge, giving instructions to the apprentices. Pride swelled quietly in his chest, not loud or boastful, but steady, like the beat of a well-made heart. When night came and the last worker left, he walked down the steps into the underground chamber one final time. The air was cool and still. The forge burned softly, its light steady as it had always been. On the wall above it, the words carved by Gideon still gleamed. Fire is memory. Labor is life. He traced the letters with his fingertips, his skin rough against the cold stone. He sat for a while on the old stool near the anvil, listening to the slow crackle of the fire. It sounded almost like breathing. In that quiet, he felt the years fold together. The fear, the hope, the discovery, the work. He thought of Gideon, of the man who had left behind a legacy not of wealth but of will. Then he thought of Ellie and of all the hands that now shaped the world above him, keeping the fire alive. When he finally rose to leave, he glanced once more at the forge. For an instant, the flame flared brighter, and in its glow, he could have sworn he saw a figure standing beside it. The same shadow he had seen that first night, clear and strong, watching. He nodded to it without fear. "Thank you," he said quietly. "We'll keep it burning." The next morning, the sun rose over Haven Creek, casting long beams of light across the fields. The forge stood silent, the fire within, reduced to a gentle glow. Outside, Ellie hung a new sign above the doorway. It was a round metal plate forged by her own hand, marked with the familiar circle and letter G, but beneath it, she had added a single word: gratitude. The wind moved softly through the trees, and from the chimney, a thin ribbon of smoke rose into the sky, steady and sure. The land that had once been forgotten now hummed with life, with laughter, with work. And deep beneath it, the forge still breathed a quiet heart of fire, endless and patient, carrying forward the promise of two men who had lived a century apart and found the same truth in their labor. The fire never died. It simply changed hands. If you were hooked by this story, don't stop here. Hit that subscribe button right now, so you never miss what comes next. Our next video will reveal another discovery even more shocking than this one. Tap the bell to be the first to see it, and share this video with your friends and family because, trust me, they won't believe what happens next.